Hello, everyone, and welcome back to War and Literature, English 1120, here at the University of Ottawa. I'm Tim Wilson. Tonight, we're going to do our second of two lectures on Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway. So the context here, we've had one lecture on World War I and its impact on literature. We had another lecture on an introduction to literary modernism and how that really manifested itself in fragmented forms of narrative, stream of consciousness, etc. And in our first lecture on Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, we talked a bit about phenomenology as a way of trying to describe how the experience or the things we experience are felt or how they appear to the one experiencing them, as opposed to, let's say, objectifying descriptions, and how, let's say, the phenomenology of time, for instance, is not necessarily that of a temporal sequence of now points going logically in a linear progression, but rather can be a chaotic movement from present to past and future. And then how the modernist authors, and how Virginia Woolf in particular, tried to take that phenomenology of time and the flow of time and try to express that in narrative through stream of consciousness, and in particular, and for Virginia Woolf, this free indirect discourse. We talked about a bit about that. And then tonight we're going to look at how the novel explores what I call deep connections between both objects and characters, as well as temporal moments in the novel. So there's this theme of deep connections. And then for the second part of the lecture, we're going to look at the impact of the war on all of the characters, and how it leaves this lasting scar, these lasting reverberations throughout the novel. So kind of war and trauma as the theme of the second part of the lecture. So let's get started by calling up our slides to guide the discussion. So we'll start with this theme of the deep connections in the novel. So we talked a bit about how the narrative's devices described in the last lecture try to represent the flow of time as opposed to distinct objects moving through distinct now points. And the entire narrative takes place in one day, a hot Wednesday in July of 1923, in terms of the bare action of the novel. However, within this day, there are eternities of temporality as experienced within the individual characters and their relations to their own lived past, and the relationship to their future, their inevitable death. So the characters will always reflect backwards, and then especially with the case with Septimus and Clarissa Dalloway, there's inevitable reflections forward to, immediately, in terms of the banality of the day, the reflections forward to planning for the party that evening, and for Mrs. Dalloway and for Septimus, ultimately imagining forward to death. So we have the presence of the past, the psychological and social implications of World War I are still felt. The summer in Burton that Clarissa had in her youth with Peter still reverberates throughout the novel and through her own experience, as well as this contemplation of the future. So in terms of the temporal connections, this image of Big Ben becomes a powerful, an overpowering image through and a narrative device in the novel. So we see an image of Big Ben, the famous tower clock in London on the right. And in some ways, it represents objective time. So we have clocks to try to give us some sort of abstract, objective representation of a temporal moment or the passage of time. and it represents, let's say, the societal definitions of let's say, sanity, of daily routine, of social expectation, as opposed to, let's say, our own lived experience. We have a couple of references I'll just point out there to that kind of objective time, the Mr. Willett's summer time referred to on page 115 of the PDF I have linked in the course, which is the daylight savings time implemented in 1916. So Big Ben indicates this objective time, but there's also phenomenological time, so time as experienced. So the narrative device of Big Ben ringing will be used to connect different characters and to show us how they're experiencing the moment differently. They're experiencing that moment and the passage of time differently. So you hear the chime of Big Ben ring out, it strikes whatever time, and maybe Clarissa's buying flowers over here, maybe Septimus is in the park experiencing time differently. Other examples of this kind of effect where we have an objective occurrence that shows different characters' perceptions or perspectives on it would be the car. So early on in the novel, there's a car backfiring, and immediately some character thought it was a pistol being fired, or in others recognize it as a car backfiring. There's also the skywriting. So there's characters discern the skywriting that's being undertaken by these planes differently. Some are perceiving different letters. And another way we have these, let's say, deep connections is, and we have the deep connections of temporality in terms of connecting past and future within our own phenomenology of time, but also our different characters' perceptions of time through one objective point. We also have a different sense of deep connections with what we could call Clarissa's transcendental theory. So here's one articulation of it on page 109 in the PDF. Clarissa once going on top of an omnibus with him somewhere, it ended in a transcendental theory that since our apparitions are so momentary compared with the other, the unseen part of us, which spreads wide, the unseen might survive. So we have physical appearances that others perceive, but those are fleeting, and that maybe there's some sort of unseen aspect of us that transcends that fleeting physical apparition. The theory seems to arise out of a dissatisfaction of our alienation with others. Remember, we talked about alienation as one of these themes that really drives all of modernist literature and art, this sense that individuals are separated from one another, that we can't really understand others, especially in modern urban societies where we don't really have communal connections. We don't know these people on an omnibus or on a bus or train to school or work. These are strangers to us. It's not as though we lived in the same small village and know their family, as might have been the case with people in previous generations of before modern industrialized, largely urbanized societies. There's also this aspect within modernism that, in addition to kind of just urban alienation because of a lack of a communal attachment, there's also alienation in the sense that we're all doomed to our own consciousness and we can't break out of it. We can't really communicate with others and can't really truly understand what the other is experiencing. So Clarissa kind of wants to transcend this alienation. You get this sense in when we feel Clarissa, well, when we hear the descriptions by the narrator of Clarissa's thoughts, that this is one of the overriding drivers of her transcendental theory, of her attempts to see ways in which there can be meaning across the moments in time. It's also, let us say, perhaps a way of thinking about the narrative technique of Virginia Woolf herself as attempting to find a way to have narrative that can go across and transcend the local points of view of the various characters? Can the narrative bring that together? Can literary art be a means by which we transcend those isolated islands that individual consciousnesses end up residing on? So here's another quote from the novel that describes Clarissa's reflections that touches on this point. So this is earlier in the novel. She would not say of anyone in the world now that they were this or were that. She felt very young, at the same time unspeakably aged. She sliced like a knife through everything, at the same time was outside looking on. She had a perpetual sense, as she watched the taxi cabs, of being out, far out to sea and alone. She always had the feeling that it was very, very dangerous to live even one day. Not that she thought herself clever or much out of the ordinary. How she had got through life on the few twigs of knowledge Fraulein Daniels gave them, she could not think. She knew nothing, no language, no history. She scarcely read a book now except memoirs in bed. And yet to her it was absolutely absorbing. All this, the cabs passing. And she would not say of Peter, she would not say of herself, I am this, I am that. So in the couple of things to point out there, that she refuses to, let us say, position subjects, individual characters, and give them certain definite identities. And that could be seen as one way in which we construct these isolated, alienated islands, is by defining and objectifying others as opposed to being more in tune with some of these deep connections that the novel seems to try to evoke. I have a note there to pay attention to. Peter Walsh has similar thoughts. I didn't give any page references, but you can attend to those when you come across Peter Walsh's reflections as well. Peter Walsh is Clarissa's childhood friend who arrives in the novel. Warren Septimus Smith is revealed to be a war hero. So this is another, let's say, the other major character in the novel. We have Clarissa Dalloway, and then we have Warren Septimus Smith. They don't know one another, but they end up being these kind of paired characters. He had won crosses, we are told. He entered the war at the beginning and survived miraculously till the end. He suffered from, quote, shell shock, and is treated by unsympathetic doctors, Holmes and Bradshaw. I'll just note, and I think we'll come back to it later in that section on war and trauma, but so in World War I, this phenomenon of shell shock really came to the fore, and it was called shell shock during World War I. And it was felt initially that this was a symptom of cowardice and weakness on the part of these patients. But later on, it was discovered that this is a medical condition. We call it post-traumatic stress disorder now, and it's a serious condition that patients need help with this. It's not some sort of lack of virtue on their part. It's a medical condition. And think about that too in respect to, let's say, the different approach today, and then even later in the last part of World War I, that to see that as a medical condition as opposed to the classical approach to courage in combat, that it was assumed that, obviously it wouldn't have been seen as a medical condition if someone was too traumatized to go to battle in the Iliad. It would be seen as a sign of cowardice. So Septimus suffers from shell shock and is treated by these doctors. He's paralyzed by sounds of the city. The car backfiring for him is paralyzing, and he reflects on his lost friend and commanding officer Evans, and carries on these conversations with him in his own mind. He talks of killing himself. Woolf, outside of the novel and other writings, we know that she intended him to be Clarissa's double. And so both reflect deeply on scarring events from their past, and they share similar visions of the deep connections that I'm talking about here behind things. They're both, let's say, they're two sides of one coin. One represents, let's say, social conformity and sophistication, Mrs. Dalloway, and then the other represents, from the perspective of others at least, the decline into madness and what is excluded from society. So Septimus has these visions, and they oscillate from despair to affirmation. So on the one hand, he sees the concealed truth behind all the authors of the Western tradition. Again, deep connections. He sees the whole tradition of all these authors as saying one truth, and that it's hidden beneath the kind of the apparent shell of the texts. And he sees that all these authors hated humanity, and it's almost this position of what's called antinatalism, that you should not bring new life into the world with its meaninglessness, what have you. So he also oscillates from that visions of despair to visions of affirmation. Preceding his suicide, he has one of these where the deep connections underneath the physical are one of joyous affirmations of the sense of encountering others truly. So not just Septimus, but also Clarissa has this notion of being connected to these texts from the past. And again, it's this notion of deep connection. So you're walking around in maybe 1923 London, but at the same time, these texts from the past are speaking to one. And one that comes up several times is this line from Shakespeare's Cymbeline, one of Shakespeare's plays, "Fear no more the heat of the sun." So it's the repeated references to this line. It's an elegy or a song sung by these characters who find the main character, Imogen, disguised as a boy at the time, and him appears to be dead. So they sing this elegy, this song of mourning over her apparently dead body. And the song is, fear no more the heat of the sun. Basically, don't fear anymore the trouble and turmoils of this world, because you're dead now. That's one of the solaces of being dead. So the play is largely a play about mistaken identity, and so we could say maybe not knowing the other. So maybe one reason why Woolf chose this play as a play to reference. The play's resolution is effected through kind of divine providence, a deus ex machina, and so this is where we have a difference between the novel and the play. There doesn't seem to be a resolution that's available, that type of resolution where we have a divine revelation of meaning that brings clarity to everyone at the end of Woolf's novel. That's not available. So the play's themes of mistaken identity, not knowing the other, of seeing one as dead, let's say this line in particular, seeing one as dead, but it's actually mistaken, that they're not really dead, that they live on in some way. That's part of Clarissa's transcendental theory. And there's several other references to Shakespeare throughout the novel. Othello is referred to, and a play concerned with jealousy, again, not knowing the mind of another. Antony and Cleopatra is referred to, lovers who pursue their passion in the face of the forces of history. So there, we have this play with the trauma that resonates of World War I, and we have lovers to an extent. We have Peter Walsh and Clarissa who are unable to, or we're never able to confirm or commit to one another, but there definitely are deep feelings there. And it's, let's say, failed Antony and Cleopatra. So Septimus and Clarissa are both paired. Another way in which they're doubles is they're both paired in their love of the bard. And this is the excuse through which, Woolf is able to bring up references to Shakespeare so frequently in the novel. So we'll see that this fear no more, the heat of the sun, that line in terms of not, in some ways embracing death as liberating. That line and that sentiment recurs in the novel, and death ends up in one of the final notes of the novel. Clarissa's reflection on hearing about the death of Septimus is this notion of death as defiance, as a way to try to communicate, to break those barriers between other selves. So let's start with this notion of being of how she thinks about seeing no reason to fear death because she'll live on in the interactions with others. So remember first of all, her transcendental theory for one thing, and then also this notion of how that connects to not needing to fear death. So this is from page 7 in the PDF. She remembered once throwing a shilling into the Serpentine, but everyone remembered what she loved was this here now in front of her, the fat lady in the cab. Did it matter then, she asked herself, walking towards Bond Street, did it matter that she must inevitably cease completely? All this must go on without her? Did she resent it, or did it not become consoling to believe that death ended absolutely, but that somehow in the streets of London, on the ebb and flow of things, here, there, she survived, Peter survived, lived on in each other, she being part, she was positive of the trees at home, of the house there, ugly, rambling, all to bits and pieces as it was, part of the people she had never met, being laid out like a mist between the people she knew best, who lifted her on their branches as she had seen the trees lift the mist, but it spread ever so far, her life, herself. But what was she dreaming as she looked into Hatchard's shop window? What was she trying to recover? What image of white dawn in the country as she read in the book spread open, fear no more the heat of the sun, nor the furious winter's rages. So she's having these, let's say, reflections. This is the narrator recounting in this free and direct discourse of the shifting thoughts of Clarissa's mind. And Clarissa seems to be reflecting on to what extent, when she's no longer alive, will she somehow endure like a mist over that somehow hangs over these trees and the branches of the trees, like people she's interacted with would hold up some sort of existence or continuing meaning to her life because of her interactions with them. As she's doing that, she's walking about in her day, she's on her errands to purchase things for the party that evening, right? And she comes along a shop and she looks through the window and there's a book open and she sees these lines. It happens to be the text of Shakespeare, and she sees these lines, fear no more the heat of the sun. So obviously, Woolf could have chosen any lines. Those are not random in a sense of the author's design for the novel. Those are there for a reason, but presented to be kind of a random occurrence. So she picked those lines, I would say, because of the resonance and the context that I mentioned about this being a song over someone who's dead, and the message about being about find consolation in death because you won't have to go through the sufferings of life anymore. And because of the context of the play in terms of it being a play about mistaken identity, etc. So this is almost at the end of the novel. This is at the party. She's hearing here about the death of Septimus, who committed suicide finally. And so the party's occurring. Mrs. Bradshaw brings this news up it's news to her. She does, as I said, she does not know Septimus, has never met him, and Mrs. Bradshaw knows because her husband is a doctor and was called when it happened. Sinking her voice, drawing Mrs. Dalloway into the shelter of a common femininity, a common pride in the illustrious qualities of husbands and their sad tendency to overwork, Lady Bradshaw, poor goose, one didn't dislike her, murmured how, just as we were starting, my husband was called up on the telephone, a very sad case, a young man, that is what Sir William is telling Mr. Dalloway, had killed himself. He had been in the army. Oh, thought Clarissa, in the middle of my party, here's death, she thought. So in some ways, part of Clarissa's response, because she's also very focused on, say, social niceties, and the party has to be the right way. Part of her first response on hearing about this death is, oh my gosh, is this bringing down the party? Why are they bringing up death at my party? She went on into the little room. That's not her only response. She does have this more profound response. So she went on into the little room where the Prime Minister had gone with Lady Bruton. Perhaps there was somebody there, but there was nobody. The chairs still kept the impress of Prime Minister and Lady Bruton. She turned deferentially, he sitting foursquare authoritatively. So she goes into this other room. The Prime Minister and Lady Bruton had been there, but were no longer there. There's an impress in the chair of where they were sitting. But so there's this presence of what is absent. So think too about the impact of the war as a temporal moment that's absent, characters that are absent, that are dead, and that absence is still making an effect in making a presence, so to speak. So too here we have this happening with Clarissa's entering in a room and still sensing the presence of characters who had just left the room. They had been talking about India. There was nobody. The party's splendor fell to the floor. So strange it was to come in alone in her finery. What business had the Bradshaws to talk of death at her party? A young man had killed himself, and they talked of it at her party. The Bradshaws talked of death. He had killed himself, but how? Always her body went through it first. When she was told suddenly of an accident, her dress flamed, her body burnt. He had thrown himself from a window. Up had flashed the ground. Through him, blundering, bruising, went the rusty spikes. There he lay with a thud, thud, thud in his brain, and then a suffocation of blackness. So she saw it. But why had he done it? And the Bradshaws talked of it at her party. So her mind is, again, this is very much this stream of consciousness, this kind of shifting without narrative connections of causality or to why this thought led to another, but her mind shifts between this trying to imagine the experience of falling and hitting the ground, hitting rusty spikes of a fence apparently that may be laying around at the side of the building. She had once thrown a shilling into the Serpentine. Remember, this is from the quote we just looked at, where she comes along the book, the Shakespeare book, Fear No More, The Heat of the Sun, and that line was there at the beginning of the novel. Never anything more. But he had flung it away. They went on living. She would have to go back. The rooms were still crowded. People kept on coming. All day she had been thinking of Burton, of Peter, of Sally. They would grow old. A thing there was that mattered. A thing wreathed about with chatter, defaced, obscured in her own life, let drop every day in corruption, lies, chatter. This he had preserved. Death was defiance. Death was an attempt to communicate. People feeling the impossibility of reaching the center which mystically evaded them, closeness drew apart. Rupture faded. One was alone. There was an embrace in death. So in Clarissa's mind, even though, for instance, Septimus and Mrs. Dalloway, Clarissa and Septimus don't know one another. They're separated by they don't hang out in the same social circles, that type of thing, but they're connected through the novel in a number of ways. And then this death sends a reverberation and somehow communicated it in a profound way to her. And in this death, she imagines a way of transcending and communicating beyond the barriers that prevent selves from genuinely communicating. She also imagines her friends Peter and Sally, and that they were all grow old. So there's the sense that temporality and the fleeting nature of their existence will mean that they will have to die as well. There's this sense of death as defiance. So a defiance of what? So I think it's a defiance of the fact that there are these things that happen in one's life, but then there's the social chatter around that dissolves it into a meaninglessness. And death was, and facing one's death in a resolute and authentic way is a way in which to defy that kind of existence of defining oneself in relationship to the social. So as I mentioned, the next theme I want to look at in the novel is this notion of war and trauma. So we talked a bit just now about how the novel's showing that there are these deep connections, temporal connections, as well as connections between the characters, and that death is one of the ways in which, for Clarissa and Septimus, they can realize or at least contemplate deep connections between individual consciousnesses, between temporal moments. So too, we want to think about how war leaves a lasting impression on the characters, lasting impact. So the narrative techniques of blurring the experiences of the various characters, as well as the notion of deep temporal connections, both of those kind of contribute to the way in which the war is always present. Even though it's 1923, the war is over, but it's always present in some way. And this is from early on. This is page 4 in the PDF. I think it's the second page of the novel. For it was the middle of June. The war was over, except for someone like Mrs. Foxcroft at the embassy last night, eating her heart out because that nice boy was killed. And now the old manor house must go to a cousin, or Lady Bexborough, who opened a bazaar, they said, with the telegram in her hand, John, her favorite, killed. But it was over, thank heaven, over. So very early in the novel, we have this very clear articulation of the war's over in an objective sense. So 1918, they signed an armistice. It was 5 years ago. In a sense of linear time, in a sense of objective time, the war is over. But in terms of how people live their lives, and let's say the phenomenology of time and how people experience time, it's constantly referred to as the scarring moment. It's constantly returned to, it's constantly present, it's constantly now for someone who's just lost their favorite son, Lady Bexborough, or for someone who was eating her heart out because that nice boy was killed, and now the manor house must go to a cousin, that type of thing. So those are obviously in traumatic ways, but also in banal ways. The war marks the experience of Mrs. Dalloway has as she walks the streets of London. So another quote here. "That is all," she said, looking at the fishmongers. "That is all," she repeated, pausing for a moment at the window of a glove shop where, before the war, you could buy almost perfect gloves. And her old Uncle William used to say, "A lady is known by her shoes and her gloves." He had turned on his bed one morning in the middle of the war. He had said, "I have had enough." So before the war, you could get good gloves at the shop. So Clarissa's let's say impact of the war is less for her directly in terms of loss. It can manifest itself in banal ways. For Virginia Woolf, for Clarissa Dalloway, the impact of the past is that the scar that's left is, well, in a couple of senses, that she had suffered from a bout of influenza that had happened around the tail end of the war, and also always returning to this moment of a summer at this house in Burton with her friends. Clarissa's daughter, Elizabeth, has a history instructor named Miss Doris Kilman, and for Miss Kilman, the war marks a turning point in her life. Miss Kilman, this is from the novel, this is page 9 of the PDF. Miss Kilman would do anything for the Russians, starved herself for the Austrians, but in private inflicted positive torture. So insensitive was she, dressed in a green Macintosh coat. Year in, year out, she wore that coat. She perspired. She was never in the room 5 minutes without making you feel her superiority, your inferiority, how poor she was, how rich you were, how she lived in a slum without a cushion or a bed or a rug or whatever it might be. All her soul rested with that grievance sticking in it, her dismissal from school during the war. So we find out later, and this is page 88 in the PDF, we find out later in the novel that the reason she lost her job at the school during the war was due to her German ancestry. So this is the impact, let's say the scar the war left on Miss Kilman. And similarly, if we look page 99 and 93 in the PDF, Miss Kilman talks about the war in terms of different perspectives. So in her instruction with Elizabeth, we see the following comments. And she talked too about the war. After all, there were people who did not think the English invariably right. There were books, there were meetings, there were other points of view. Would Elizabeth like to come with her to listen to so-and-so, a most extraordinary looking old man? Then Miss Kilman took her to some church in Kensington, and they had tea with a clergyman. She had lent her books, law, medicine, politics. All professions are open to women of your generation, said Miss Kilman. But for herself, her career was absolutely ruined. And was it her fault? Good gracious, said Elizabeth, no. So there's a couple things there, that this notion that there are different perspectives on the war, just as there are those different perspectives on the skywriting, or the different perspectives when a car backfires. There's so different perceptions. So too the war. Miss Kilman's approach is to study these different, let's say, scholarly perspectives on it, but the novel's approach is to show how, again, Lady Bexborough or Clarissa or Septimus each have their own impacts of the war and their lived experience, less of a, let's say, detached scholarly approach to it. The other thing about Miss Kilman there in what we just looked at is her notion of these avenues of education are open to women now. That was not the case necessarily when Clarissa was younger. And she referred to in a quote we looked at earlier how she had only bits of knowledge that she had gotten from her teacher. So the war is somewhat present in the naming. I think there's something going on there in terms of war being there in kind of a general sense in the names. You know, Septimus, Warren, Smith. In a way, he's still warring, or he's still in the war. And Doris Kilman, you know, Doris takes a feminist approach to the war, a way that you could say that she wants to kill man, or at least the male dominance of the interpretation of war, the male dominance of the professions. The other point there we could make is part of the trauma of war is it can cause participants or the loved ones who lose members of their family. It can cause a loss of identity. So Septimus, for example, his experience of the war fundamentally changes him such that he's no longer himself. And this is page 17 of the PDF. She could tell nobody, not even Septimus now, and looking back, she saw him sitting in his shabby overcoat alone, on the seat, hunched up, staring. And it was cowardly for a man to say he would kill himself, but Septimus had fought. He was brave. He was not Septimus now. So this is his partner reflecting on the fact that he's no longer the hero, that Septimus is no longer the hero that was promoted through the war and what had achieved so highly in the war. He comes back with these scars and is unable to function and is not Septimus now, is no longer himself. Compare that to, if you see on 61 on the PDF, Mr. Brewer, another character we just see in passing, had anticipated great things for Septimus, but the war ruined all of that. So there's a passage on 61 that describes that. I won't go into that. Septimus' experience of the war is present in the sense that he still speaks to Evans, his dead companion. She must go back to Septimus since it was almost time for them to be going to Sir William Bradshaw. She must go back and tell him, go back to him sitting there on the green chair under the tree talking to himself, or to that dead man Evans, whom she had only seen once for a moment in the shop. He had seemed a nice, quiet man, a great friend of Septimus's, and he had been killed in the war. So the Septimus, his first reaction, we find out upon on the death of Evans, was stoic, and then it left an impact later. So this quote from 62, page 62, but when Evans, Regia, who had only seen him once, called him a quiet man, a sturdy red-haired man, undemonstrative in the company of women. When Evans was killed just before the armistice in Italy, Septimus, far from showing any emotion or recognizing that here was the end of a friendship, congratulated himself upon feeling very little and very reasonably. The war had taught him it was sublime. He had gone through the whole show: friendship, European war, death, had won promotion, was still under 30 and was bound to survive. He was right there. The last shells missed him. He watched them explode with indifference. When peace came, he was in Milan, billeted in the house of an innkeeper with a courtyard, flowers in tubs, little tables in the open, daughters making hats. And to Lucretia, the younger daughter, he became engaged one evening when the panic was on him that he could not feel. So this notion of Septimus's trauma, the impact of a lost comrade, echoes our first work that we looked at. Echoes the oldest war literature, the Iliad, for example, and Achilles' profound grief and anger over the loss of Patroclus in Homer's Iliad. So it's very parallel to that of Septimus, but it expresses itself in different ways. There, Achilles' grief is, let's say it's excessive, but he's still the hero that he is. He's still a leader of his society. With Septimus, it's dismissed as a craziness, as a mental illness or lack of fortitude, and his manifestations of this grief in no way lead to the type of heroic epics to be sung about a Septimus that we would have of an Achilles. So as I mentioned, the shell shock is for us, we would be post-traumatic stress disorder, and early on these victims were seen as cowardly, and we note in the novel Dr. Holmes calls Septimus a coward in this page 107 for having killed himself. Another impact of the war, let's say, or trauma, is a sense of almost repression of the memory or forgetting. So Septimus seems to actively forget the war. This is page 69. He has this exchange with the Dr. Bradshaw. Prescribed a little bromide, said there was nothing the matter. Ah, yes, those general practitioners, thought Sir William. It took half his time to undo their blunders. Some were irreparable. You served with great distinction in the war. The patient repeated the war interrogatively. He was attaching the meanings to words. He was attaching meanings to words of a symbolical kind, a serious symptom to be noted on the card. So that last part. So this is an exchange. We need to sift out who's saying what, right? And who's thinking what. So the first part, prescribed a little bromide, said there's nothing in the matter. Of course he did. So these are the thoughts of the doctor, William Bradshaw, and he's thinking to himself. And then he says to Septimus, you served in the war with great distinction. And Septimus returned, war? He says interrogatively. And Bradshaw is thinking to himself, he's attaching meanings to words of a symbolical kind. So he's kind of thinking through the words. The words don't really make sense to him anymore. It's a serious symptom to be noted on the card. This is Bradshaw's reflection. And then Septimus says again, the war, the patient asked. The European war, that little shindy of schoolboys with gunpowder. Had he served with distinction, he really forgot in the war itself he had failed. So those are the thoughts either of Septimus or Bradshaw. It's not entirely clear, or the narrator. So this is part of where this free and direct discourse can really brings together these, say the connections among the characters. It really, we seamlessly go from one to the other. Septimus volunteered because he idealized the situation and the patriotism of the cause. So this is from page 62. Septimus was one of the first to volunteer. He went to France to save an England which consisted almost entirely of Shakespeare's plays, and Miss Isabel Pole in a green dress walking in a square. There in the trenches, the change which Mr. Brewer desired when he advised football was produced instantly. He developed manliness. He was promoted. He drew the attention, indeed the affection of his officer, Evans by name. So on this notion of, you notice he developed manliness, and it was a patriotic cause that he joined the war. So both the patriotism and being up for war if one is manly. So there's a certain social construction of gender attached to war that we've mentioned a couple times. So I'll just refer to this passage. Lady Bruton refers to this being English to the bone without reading Shakespeare, and by virtue of being a woman, although cannot be a warrior for England, will be a warrior in another way, she says on page 129. Here's a kind of an example of a reflection on war and loss, and that brings, let's say, a juxtaposition between presence and absence, or being and nothingness. This is from page 82 to 83. And Peter Walsh is thinking of the miracle that there's all those lost in the war. While he's walking, he still exists. The time comes when it can't be said. One's too shy to say it, he thought, pocketing his sixpence or two of change, setting off with his great bunch held against his body to Westminster to say straight out in so many words, whatever she might think of him, holding out his flowers, I love you. Why not? Really, it was a miracle, thinking of the war and thousands of poor chaps with all their lives before them shoveled together, already half forgotten. It was a miracle. Here he was walking across London to say to Clarissa in so many words that he loved her, which one never does say, he thought. Partly one's lazy, partly one's shy. So again, this thoughts of being in nothingness that coincide. Well, so a couple of things there. Like, I think there's a sense of reflecting on death and loss underscores deeply and underscores prominently the fact that one is, and underscores one's being, and brings it to a brighter essence for one, being able to see that and reflect on it for what it is, that loss. So So I think there's that going on in Peter's reflections on those who are lost in World War I. There's also this sense of it being a miracle, let's say a sense of gratitude that one's alive when so many had lost their lives, and why not, let's say, take this gift and fully appreciate it by throwing caution to the wind and saying I love you, as opposed to being afraid of what others will think. So I'll close there, and with that final comments on the novel. So we looked at Mrs. Dalloway in relationship to first of all phenomenology and the experience of the temporal flow that one has, and how we see that temporal flow arrive in terms of deep connections among characters and among times of the characters' experiences. And we also looked at war and trauma, and how war has had this lasting impact on so many of the characters in the novel. We're closing with Mrs. Dalloway, I think a fitting modernist novel, a beautiful novel in my opinion, but also in terms of this theme of our course, war and literature, a fitting place to end in terms of going back to the beginning in relationship to war and trauma that we saw in the Iliad, and how we saw Achilles react to the death of a comrade, but also in relationship to some of the other themes that came up in terms of in the Aeneid and in Shakespeare, whether or not dying for one's community or war on behalf of the nation or the community gives war its meaning, its justification, and I think in Woolf's novel, it's not necessarily the case that we can hang a hat on that, I would say, as for many of the modernists and for the World War I poets that we also looked at briefly. So I hope you've enjoyed that novel. I hope you enjoyed the course, and I certainly enjoyed teaching it with you. Thank you.